So thank you, good afternoon everybody. Huge thanks to Caroline Derry for putting on this fantastic conference. It was very exciting to meet Margaret earlier. And thank you, Caroline, for your invitation asking me to speak about the relationship between biographer and subject. I imagine that you asked me to do this because I think there's it's not a secret that I am completely in love with a woman that I researched, the first woman lawyer, called Helena Normanton. So what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes is really talk to you a little bit about the biography that I wrote about Helena Normanton, give you a little bit of context about me and my career, so that, because obviously I'm speaking to you through my own lens, and so I need to give you some context so that you can actually make an assessment of what I'm saying to you. But I also want to just really think about what's the purpose of biography, and also what are the problems with writing biographies, and also the problems with reading biographies as well. I'd like to give you a little flavour of Helena and my relationship with her, and really tell you some of the lessons that I've learned, and warn you about the dangers that if you're considering writing a biography, or perhaps you're reading a biography, just to be aware of the dangers that can be faced by the writer of a biography, and also to think about how you can really ameliorate those dangers. And then I'll end with some concluding thoughts. So rather a lot to do in 15 minutes. So Helena Normanton was, as you've heard, the first woman to be admitted to an institution of the legal profession once the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 was passed. So I practiced at the bar in 1992 and after that, but I became a property law academic, and any of the law academics in the audience will recognise that property lawyers, academics, we are a certain type. Life is really quite black and white for us, I would suggest. But I had practiced at the bar, and I then became a law teacher, and I had never ever heard of Helena Normanton. I didn't find out about her until 2002. I was working at London Metropolitan University, and London Met at that time owned the Women's Library, and they went into a beautiful building in Castle Street called the Washrooms, and they put on an exhibition to open this beautiful building. And they asked me if I would come along and really do one of the windows on law, so as to form part of the exhibition. So I went to the Women's Library, and I went into a room that was windowless, and somehow that's really significant to me, because I went into this room and it was almost like being in a vacuum. And on the tables were these 18 boxes of uncatalogued materials that contained the archives of Helena Normanton. And I was amazed. I had never heard of this woman. So I'd been to law school, I had practiced at the bar, and then I became a law teacher, but I had never ever heard of this woman. I had always just taken it as my right to be there, you know, that I was perfectly entitled to be at the bar. I'd given no thought to, in fact, the process that had happened in order for women to be able to practice at the bar. So anyway, I did this window, I collected items out of the boxes, and Antonia Byatt, who was the director of the Women's Library, said to me at the end of this process, you can't leave her there. You just can't leave her in these boxes. But I had a PhD already set up. It was at SOAS, it was on dowries, it fitted perfectly with my background as a property lawyer. It was very neat and tidy. It would have been over probably in about 2.5 years. But I got rid of that, and I just focused on Helena Normanton. She became the sole purpose of my research. And it was difficult because I had no background in history whatsoever, and also no really background in biography. I was very lucky that I had a fantastic supervisor, Professor Pat Vane. So if we could just reflect really on what a biography does, because I never set out to write a biography. I set out really just to write about Helena Normanton's work in opening the legal profession up to women. And with biography, there is this assumption that there is a truth, that there is one sole truth. But in fact, there aren't. There are so many different truths and so many interpretations of that truth, and that truth changes over time. So what is truth perhaps in 1919 isn't truth in 2019. It changes all the time, and that's very difficult. And what biography attempts to do is to reconstruct a life. And of course, no one can reconstruct a life because we didn't live it. And obviously there's an interpretation on that reconstruction. But biography really wants to explain an achievement. And for Helena Normanton, it was the opening of the legal profession to women. But how do you explain that achievement? Again, there is no one sole explanation of that. So really biography is about storytelling that is truthful, that there's a true story. It isn't a work of fiction. And what you do as a biographer is that you emulate the voice of a person who knew the subject, and you do that by doing lots of research and finding out the words that have perhaps been spoken or written by your particular subject. So you use their words in order to recreate their voice, or you recreate the voice of a person who knew them. And a lot has been written on this, and Teckham described it as a well-staged illusion, and Virginia Woolf spoke about it as a literary friendship. A complicated relationship between biographer and subject. And of course there are so many expectations on you. You have the reader's expectations, they want the story and they want an explanation. Anybody who reads it is going to suddenly become a critic of your work. They will think that there are gaps and flaws in your work, but of course they haven't been in your shoes and realised, in fact, there are so many gaps that the archives aren't complete. The right questions weren't asked at the time. And of course the biographer has an expectation. They want an accurate and coherent story. That's really what they're setting out. It's this accuracy and truth that they want to tell. Now usually biography are usually written in a chronological order, because it's almost as if you know the person from birth to grave. That's really the simplest way of doing it. You can do it in themes, but perhaps it's easiest to do it in a chronological order. But there will inevitably be interpretations that are put on that story. So the biographer will comment and they'll intercept it with history and perhaps notable events that are happening at that time. But of course, you can't fill in the gaps. That's not the job of the biographer. If there are gaps in the information, then you have to leave that. But really what you're doing is trying to give an account of that achievement. Hermione Lee said that biography is about, you can describe it as a sort of describing a life, summing it up, packaging it and selling it. And that's difficult because, as I said, there is no one truth. And if you don't package it up, then people will feel cheated and the biography will sort of be seen as flawed. But of course there isn't a truth. So the relationship between the biographer and the subject is always going to come with baggage, with self-identification. Certainly with Helena Normanton, I self-identified with her, firstly, of course, because I'm a feminist, and she was clearly a feminist, but there were other things in our background. We were both very working class. I'm from East Sussex, she was from East Sussex, and we both clearly have this huge attachment to the place that really formed us. I was a first generation university student. Helena Normanton never even went to university. She did her degree by extension, but we were both first generation lawyers. And neither of us had a working role model for wanting to become a lawyer. The most both of us had was the fact that we had grandfathers who were Metropolitan Police officers, which is perhaps the law for people of our class. And she had lost her father, firstly by separation, and then he died. And although my father is very alive and present and part of my family, my mother had an absent father, so I could really relate to that loss. And because of that loss, I could relate to her female-centered family circumstances. So I had experience of that. And I think both of us were very ambivalent about the bar as a career, really for anybody who is an outsider. So not just for women, but for people who were perhaps more working class or from a different race. It's perhaps not the most welcoming of professions. So I had this real self-identification with her, and for years I have felt such a sense of shame about it. But actually, that sense of shame as being, and I'm a Catholic, so that's probably where that comes from, but probably now I realise that in fact self-identification is absolutely normal. And if you read any biographer's sort of account of the writing of the biography they've been doing, they all openly admit to it. And in fact, on the race project that you're going to hear a little bit about in a moment from Avis and Seema, you will see I'm in charge of the lists for that project, and everybody, well, virtually everybody who has taken a life has asked for somebody that they could relate to is normal and natural, because we're looking for a fit. So in fact, I have realised now that it's normal and natural. So why do we do it? I think obviously you're going to have to write, you're going to spend hours with this person. So of course you're going to look for somebody that you're interested in and that you have a fit with. Susie Boyd wrote that, in fact, and I won't read you the quote, but she says that, you know, writing a biography is really having you invite somebody into your head, and not just for a week or so, but for years. And she said, you know, who would in their right mind would do that? And she said, biographers do. And in fact, you know, you are ambushed at night, in the morning, when you're working on it, by this person. You know, they are very much present in your head. Many biographers write about, you know, hearing messages from the person or from seeing them. So it becomes an obsession. I think it's all that you want to discuss. You have this incredible, intense closeness with the other person, and you're living in two worlds. Certainly for me, I was living in the land of the living and then in the land of the dead with these dead women. So it did for me become very much a love affair, a very intense friendship. But it's not just a relationship with the subject, it's also a relationship with the people who were in their circle. So with Helena, it was her father-in-law, her husband, Claude Schuster, who wrote the appeal for her when she was rejected by the Inns of Court, the other women lawyers, her niece, her sisters and aunts. So it becomes all-encompassing, all-engulfing. And there's a picture of a nose here on this, because in fact, every time I don't feel any sort of protectiveness over her materials, in sort of as though they're mine. But whenever I go to the Women's Library, I smell them. And that maybe sounds a bit strange, but it's almost as if, you know, you smell the past and you touch them. It actually connects you with it. And lots of her archives contain things such as her fee books, papers. So you have a connection to your subject through their archives. But there are really two stories going on, aren't there? There's a story of the subject, and there's a story of the biographer and their recreation. But you have to keep them. There are dangers. Very quickly, there's a danger that you will portray yourself within your work, that you'll over-identify, you'll become soppy or sentimental, blindingly loyal or blindingly have a sort of admiration. You might become too defensive or have disgust or betrayal. But I don't think any biographer is stupid enough to become blindingly loyal. You know, when I discovered that Helena Normanton she described, and her words, that Negroes, by all means, encourage them to become lawyers or to have a profession, but make sure they know how to sweep floors and do domestic work as something to fall back on if they can't cope with the rigours of professional life. And you know, that's just what she thought. I have no control over that, and it's no good me or anybody else thinking, well, she was a product of her time. She didn't believe that for people who were Asian. It's only clearly for black people that she saw that. So I think perhaps the question that the biographer has to ask is how much should they assert their presence, and they should discuss that in their work. So very quickly, in 3 seconds, I'm going to turn it off because it will make a noise. Just so to finish, I think identification with your subject is normal and natural, but it needs to be discussed within your work. For me, I put it into the introduction. The biographer obviously needs to be aware and cautious of the dangers, but you know, your self-identification can't be avoided, but the dangers can certainly be mitigated. So thank you. Thanks very much.